Hi there. So I've reviewed most of the music books in my library uh, over the past few weeks, and it's really been leading up to today's book, which, in my opinion, is the best one out there on the subject. Now, Beatles books has become um, an industry in itself. In Waterstones, my local bookstore in Liverpool, there is a whole shelf just on Beatles. There's another section on music, but the Beatles have a section just to themselves, and it gets regularly new editions all the time. People have written some really, really good books about the Beatles, and I've reviewed quite a few of them. But there are some really strange books written by the guy who cut their hair, or a history of the Beatles in Ireland, of their numerous visits to Ireland. Um, so, in the whole mass of literature out there, to have written the best book is quite an accolade. And the book I'm referring to is The Beatles All These Years, Volume One, Tune In, which is the first of what will be a trilogy, hopefully. It goes up from the earliest days of their lives up to 1962. It actually um, finishes on New Year's Eve. So Mark Lewisohn, who wrote the book, um, did, has done an amazing job. And it, I'll just quote directly what I wrote in a review. There was a review in a national newspaper which criticised this book as being bogged down in too much detail. I disagree. The basic story of the Beatles is very well known, and it's this depth of detail that brings new insights, new revelations, so that the history you thought you knew becomes a whole new story. Reading the book, you never get the feeling that you're wading through a mass of detail. This is because, firstly, the book presents you with so much new information. There is virtually a surprise on every page. Secondly, Mark Lewisohn has such an easy narrative style, full of humour and with an obvious affection for the subject. He is really acknowledged by other Beatles historians as being the Beatles historian. He was the one that the Beatles themselves employed when they were putting together their famous anthology. And he also wrote the complete history of the recordings in Abbey Road. And his access is amazing. It took 10 years to write this first volume, and it shows. He must have read every book, magazine, interview, article, contract, invoice, and scribbled beer mat that was out there. However, he hasn't just accepted everything en masse, he verifies. He doesn't accept someone's word for it, he cross checks and cross references in order to present the most accurate history possible. And one of the things that struck me in the book was the role of luck throughout the book. Now, in a discussion on the Beatles Forum, one of the guys who is very, very well versed in the Beatles kind of challenged this, and sort of the Beatles were so talented that they would have, sorry, just checking something, they would have triumphed, whatever. And the book reveals that's not the case. There are quite a few times when they could have gone separate ways. Uh, One of the bits of luck was that the government here abolished national service, the call up, the conscription, because John Lennon, like all 18-year-olds, was facing 2 years compulsory military service. And as we've seen with other people, we saw with Elvis, for example, how to go and join the army, it can put a crimp in your career. and it certainly would have changed the story of the Beatles in a significant way, because John would not have been able to have gone to Hamburg. And Hamburg, and I've reviewed books just on just devoted to the subject of the Beatles in Hamburg, was such an important part of the story. Um, John would have either been in the army or, in my opinion, probably been in Ireland. He probably legged it to Ireland to avoid military service. So that's one bit of luck, that the government just his was the age group where they stopped conscription. Similarly, to get to Hamburg, John managed to get a passport in record time. How he did it really is a mystery, because the bureaucracy is usually very slow. He didn't have a passport, and at the last minute applied for one. Another bit of good fortune was that the two significant figures in their career, the manager Brian Epstein and the recording producer George Martin, were both decent chaps, and didn't take advantage of it. And this is in an industry where that is very much the exception. If you look at the story of other managers, such as Larry Parnes and so on, right through, there was a TV documentary about these guys who were sharks, charlatans, who just ripped off the guys ruthlessly. Brian Epstein looked after the guys. And George Martin, he was just on a salary from Parlophone, and he devoted an awful lot of his professional experience and expertise to making the records. Now, the story of how Brian Epstein secured the Parlophone record deal is such a convoluted series of confluences of events that it's like unraveling a mystery. And it all starts with a chance meeting of a guy from Liverpool that Brian Epstein knew from up here in a London street. Brian came out of a meeting and just bumped into this guy. What are you doing? Blah blah blah. I can help, and introduced him, which became a series of steps that led to the Parlophone deal. Absolute luck. And the Parlophone deal was their last chance. After that, it would have been approaching Embassy, who were the label that did covers, and there's no way the Beatles would have ever recorded any of their own original material. The book not only gives us the story of the Beatles, both as a band and individually, but is a snapshot of Liverpool life in the in that particular period. Now, Mark Lewisohn doesn't come from Liverpool; he comes from London, but he has mastered the idiom. He understands how people spoke, the slang, the vernacular of that time, in a way that very, very few other people um, from outside the area have been able to do. And it really makes the book, gives it an extra level of authenticity. Now, I've mentioned many, many times the famous appearance at Litherland Town Hall on the 27th of December. You're probably fed up with me mentioning it. But one of the reasons I mentioned it so much is something that Mark Lewisohn says in his summing up of it. He says, and this was one of the surprises when I read the book, that when they appeared at Litherland Town Hall, they were probably the most experienced rock band in the world, because of the hours they'd spent on stage in Hamburg refining their craft. And it very much goes into that 10,000 hours uh, to be expert at any field. He also captures the excitement of those early appearances uh, in and around Liverpool, where the audience were totally into what the Beatles were presenting, both the music and also the antics they got up to on stage. And the period from Litherland until the end of the book was the pinnacle of the live appearances. Those of the people who were lucky enough to see them then in and around Liverpool, and I wasn't one of them. I started going to the Cavern and just missed out on actually seeing the Beatles. But I saw many of the other Merseybeat bands. Uh, that live excitement um, was denied to subsequent fans because of the screams and the crowd noise and the mob mentality, which meant the Beatles couldn't really interact with the fans anymore. Because the book again shows um, their interaction with the fans. It's really touching. While the Beatles were over in Hamburg, they regularly kept in touch with some of the fans. They used to send them postcards and letters, and some of them are reproduced, and they're really touching. It's a really nice relationship, which uh, and also they would give some of the young girls a lift in the van, and there was no ulterior motive to this. You know, most of the guys had steady girlfriends, and they just would look after their young friends. And for the first time, I really understood why Pete Best was sacked. Now, there's a whole book dedicated to this, or two actually, which I've reviewed, Drummed Out, and also Pete Best's own book. And neither really give you the reason, um, because no one really knew it. But putting all the pieces together, Mark Lewisohn has presented the best verdict on that, and it was a verdict that I actually uh, didn't really understand myself because I was told by my good friend Tommy Mack, who was a doorman at the cabin, that he thought the reason they got rid of Pete was he was too popular with the girls. He said whenever the Beatles were there, the girls were all over Pete to the exclusion of everyone else. And that was the accepted wisdom for me for a long time. But that's not really the case. Uh, and Mark does lay out the underlying story in a way. Love Me Do, Beatles' first UK record after the few things they did in Germany. Uh, the significance has been downplayed in the histories, really. But as Mark says, to have a first record by an unknown group make it into the top 20 and stay there longer than most others, despite absolutely no promotion by the record company, was huge. The Beatles were battling the London centric music business at this time, who were hostile. They detested the name, they detested the fact that they came from Liverpool or from outside of London anyway, from up north. They didn't like their accents. They thought that that type of band with four musicians and no leader was an anachronism, and they didn't give them any real support. And the Beatles actually changed the music business themselves. So to sum up, really, I can't recommend this book highly enough. It's a superb book. I'll put a link to uh, the reviews on the Beatles Forum and also to um, a podcast interview, Word in Your Ear, with Mark Lewisohn, where it's not so much about this book, but it's about other aspects of the Beatles story that he has unearthed, which are absolutely amazing. Some of the songs, the lyrics refer to real events, and he's researched the people or places involved, and it's just absolutely fascinating. He's still working on volume two, which is probably it's definitely from 62 onwards. The next couple of years is the rise of the Beatles as the records break and as they start touring. So that's going to be amazing, and the amount of information he's having to research to do that is obviously very it's a daunting task. But that should be out next couple of years, I guess. And I'll have my credit card in hand to buy that as soon as it's published. Just to sum up, this is the best history of the Beatles. It's the most entertaining, the most thorough, most comprehensive, and it's the one that everyone else is going to have to refer to. And just a point on that, one of the things that Mark Lewisohn has found, that there's a lot of disinformation which is repeated in other books. People read it in one place, use it as gospel, and it becomes part of the history. And he dispels a lot of the myths and does a very, very valuable job just doing that in itself.